Madam Speaker, in today's debate the affirmative team were incredibly ignorant of how NGOs actually get permission to come into countries and how they're allowed to stay there. We think that NGOs are able to get access to these nations because they present themselves as being non-military actors, and they present themselves as wanting to deliver aid equally between all people within that nation rather than one specific group. We think that this leads, this leads me to my first point, which is about how they deliver aid. And what we heard from Kiran was that you can't distribute aid effectively in these regions as they're often war-torn and unstable, and that's why you need private military contractors to come in to protect these groups. We don't think this is true. Firstly, we think that NGOs are relatively good at forming working relationships with the individuals and tribes within that region. And we think that's because of the reason that they provide them with food, they provide them with medical assistance and things like that. We think that through that, they are able to actually get into these regions and go about delivering the aid that they want to deliver. Secondly, we think that you actually make it worse because you make it harder for these groups to get accepted into this nation when they are no longer under the veil of being non-military actors or being independent actors wanting to distribute aid equally because they've got arms behind them to get what they want. And then finally, we think, so we think that they actually undermine how we best deliver aid. But secondly, to the issue of whether NGOs will actually leave. And what we heard from Kiran was that people will die in these NGOs, and the NGOs can't afford to insure people, so they're not going to stick around in these regions when they become war-torn. We don't think this is true either. We think that the motives that actually motivate NGOs to go to these regions and stick around are largely for more deeply held reasons than that. We think that these volunteers often want to go along to these regions, and due to the fact that there's a large host of NGOs, we think that there's always one that is willing to, at the end of the day, risk it and stick around for the humanitarian basics. But secondly, we think that this ignores the role of the UN in this, in aid distribution. And what we heard from Kiran was that the UN just don't stick around, they pull out really easily. We don't think that's true because we think that nations, when they commit troops to the UN, they actually want to see the end result come about rather than just waste their time sending troops in and then pulling them out because it's suddenly got maybe too unstable for them to want to stick around. And then secondly, we heard that NGOs will leave because they can't develop relationships with local groups. I've already responded to that in the first bit of rebuttal. Now thirdly, to the idea of accountability. And we heard that you need the nation's support in order to stay in this country. But we think that they make it harder because we think because of the reasons that you're not going to get the nation's support when you want to go in there with black border and heaps of guns. We think that makes it really hard for anyone to actually want to allow these groups in. But secondly, we think that it's really hard to hold these private military contractors in order to be accountable, when things are being, decisions are being made in the heat of battle in these really unstable regions. So we think that, Blackwater are going to do things, we're going to see things like the Blackwater massacre that happened in Iraq. We think the US government is really bad at keeping private military contractors accountable. We don't think that NGOs are going to be particularly better in that regard. In fact, we think that they're going to be demonstrably worse. Secondly, though, we think it's individuals within these groups that can undermine this accountability mechanisms, because all it takes is one individual within Blackwater or the group that they're hiring, and then that's going to cause these issues. Okay, so now to the substantive, and I've got three key issues. So firstly, how do these NGOs actually get entry into these countries, and what are their purposes, and how this undermines it? Secondly, who are these private military contractor groups? And thirdly, the harms to the region. So firstly, how do these groups get access? And I told you that these groups are able to get access to these countries when they're in a position to still bar people from coming in and out of their countries, because they are able to present themselves as being non-military and delivering aid equally. But we think that you undermine this because of several reasons. Firstly, when you have these groups going in with private military contractors taking essentially military actions in order to ensure that their objectives are met, we think that this has the effect of undermining the support for the West more generally within these regions. So we think that largely these groups NGOs are viewed as a Western construction, and when they go in there with guns and they're like attacking the Syrian army because it's tried to prevent them from delivering aid to a certain group, we think that undermines the support for the NGOs more generally within that group, because they're viewed as being like a part of the West and a part of the Western's mission. But secondly, we don't think the factions that actually control these regions are going to let people in. So we don't think in Somalia the Al-Shabaab are going to be very happy with allowing private military contractors to come into their region. We think that's going to create a lot of instability, and we think that's probably what's going to, at the end of the day, make these the people who volunteer for these NGOs and work in these NGOs more likely to be a target, because they're viewed as Western aggressors rather than providers of aid to the Al-Shabaab. So, secondly, to who we hire as private military contractors. And we view this as being two groups. So firstly, we view it as elite international organisations such as Blackwater and things like that. And then secondly, we think it can be local tribes that will be provided with weapons. What we heard was that they're going to want the best people for the job. So we can only assume that this means it will vary from case to case on which one they're going to accept. But even if they had only intended one, we think there are only a limited number of international organisations, and seeing as that we're so willing to cut them the moment they do something wrong, we think eventually you're probably going to have to resort to the locals as well. So firstly, to international organisations. And we don't think they're as good, because we think that local groups that are going to oppose these private military contractors are aware of the local terrain and are able to ambush these groups. So we don't think that they're going to be able to effectively provide the support and assistance to these NGOs and these volunteers. But secondly, we think that if we supply locals and we give them guns, we think that that's going to create loyalty issues. So we don't think that they're going to be particularly loyal to the NGOs. We think that they're probably the kinds of people who are going to take the highest offer kind of thing like that. But secondly, how do we have accountability within these groups? Because we think that they lessen accountability mechanisms, because we don't think that it's really easy to hold these private military contractors accountable for war crimes, because it's hard to identify individuals or events involved in that war crime. So again, we'll point to the example of the Blackwater massacre in Iraq. We think if they can do it there, they'll be able to do it in Somalia. But secondly, it's really hard to control these groups, because they're independent bodies and they operate independently. So they're going to do things that they want, like a Blackwater massacre, or if they're an individual tribal group, we think that they're going to carry out things like reprisal attacks as a result of their newfound weapons in mind. Now finally, onto the idea of the harms to the region. And we think that it has the ability to further undermine these already really unstable regions. Because what we're doing is we're essentially going into Somalia and bringing more guns into that area, whether that be through an international organisation or providing a particular tribal group with more guns. We think that that's going to lead to more conflict and more conflict between tribal groups if we provide the tribal groups with guns. For all these reasons, we're more than proud to